welcome to an Ode to Birth podcast. Today I'm here with Daniel Williams. Very excited to jump into German New Medicine. Daniel, I'd love to hand it over to you right away and just have you share with us, what is German New Medicine? What is all the hype? I think it's getting quite popular, and I'd love to know a little bit more.
Yeah, thanks, Madison. It is actually growing quite a bit right now. Yeah, I only came across it, I guess, a bit over 2 years ago. My friends Castine and Natasha brought it to me first, and it was just, yeah, it was the perfect timing, and I really absorbed it quickly because it just made so much sense. And it's like when you're learning all these different health and healing related, pieces of bodies of knowledge and applying them to your own life. This one just was the most foundational that I'd ever learned, and it just really describes why we experience all of our symptoms. And they're all meaningful. So it just right away, we're no longer, fearing and fighting symptoms, and it all just makes sense. And they're all meaningful adaptations to perceived conflict shocks, conflicts that we've, encountered in our lives, basically. And it's only really an issue if we get stuck in what's called a hanging healing. But I don't know, do you want me to share my screen as well? And then we can do a little intro to German New Medicine?
Absolutely. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. And then we can go through whichever programs. They're called biological programs. I'll give the intro first because then it'll make more sense what I'm talking about. So first, I'll actually tell Dr. Hamar's story. It's interesting, just briefly for a minute or two, a couple minutes. So he was a really well-respected doctor in Germany, and he had medical patents. He was an inventor, and he also happened to be very aligned with nature. And I just think he was just a genius, basically. And when he was about 40, he had done very well for himself as a doctor and with all those medical patents as well that he had. And then his son had this tragic death where he got shot. This was in 1978. His son was about 18, and it was a really weird situation. I won't get into that deeply, but after a few months, he ended up dying. And then Dr. Hamar got testicular cancer shortly after. And he's a conventional doctor, and they don't really get into the correlations between, traumas, conflicts, and physical symptoms. But he basically, postulated there had to be a correlation. So he became the head, he got his testicle removed, which he wouldn't have done later with what he learned. But he lived, and he became the head internist at a Munich cancer clinic, oncology clinic, basically associated with the university there. And he started talking to all the patients, and he started finding that all the patients, regardless of if they had testicular cancer or any type of cancer, had some type of what he went on to call a biological conflict shock prior to their diagnoses. So he started using brain scan too, because he presumed that the brain had to be the control center for the body, and he was right. And he started finding, excuse me, these circular lesions in particular spots in the brain. We'll look at some pictures of those after, dependent on the person's interpretation of the conflict and dependent on the symptoms that they had. So basically what he discovered was that the psyche, which even includes our soul and really every aspect of us, of each of us, that causes us to perceive in a particular way, because we all perceive uniquely, of course. So it's the science of the psyche, the brain, and the body. So the psyche is us interpreting the conflict, and then dependent on our interpretation, a lesion forms in the brain in a particular spot. And he's got it all mapped out by the different germ layers. Like here we can see there's the cerebral cortex, down below here, the cerebral medulla, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. And so these areas of the brain are all full of relays, essentially, for different organs or tissues in the body. And upon receipt of that conflict shock, like basically the lesion forms right away, and this biological program is initiated in the body right away to help us deal with the perceived conflict and or to make the organ or tissue stronger at the completion of the program. So down below, and jump in anytime if you ever have questions, please. Down below here at the bottom where my cursor is, this is basically a depiction of all disease, all illness, what we call a biological program, basically. So what they're saying is that over on the left here, sympathectonia, that's just saying that we're more sympathetic in the day, we're more elevated just naturally. And then Vagatonia is more rest and digest, like vagatonic, the parasympathetic. So just within reasonable boundaries, we're more sympathetic in the day, more parasympathetic at night as we sleep, ideally. And then we have the DHS. So this is the conflict shock. This is the criteria are generally that it is acute, isolating, and unexpected. So the felt sense is, acute, isolating, and unexpected, caught on the wrong foot. And it's named after his son, Durkhammer. So Durkhammer syndrome, basically. So that initiates all illness and disease. And then we move into the conflict active state. So now we're stuck in that sympathetic state. So, our hands and feet might be cold. This is a symptom of being stuck in the sympathetic, and we're not digesting as well, we're not sleeping as well, because everything is mobilized to resolve the conflict. We're thinking a lot about the conflict, and now we have an adaptation occurring in the organ or tissue that's affected, depending on our interpretation. So if the organ or tissue is derived from the brainstem, so that's endodermic tissue. I know it can be a bit confusing with the brain region, but if people choose to study German new medicine, it all becomes quite natural pretty soon. So brainstem is endodermic tissue, and it controls all the endodermic tissue in the body. Cerebellum is old mesodermic tissue, and it controls all the old mesodermic tissue in the body. Cerebral medulla is new mesodermic tissue, and it controls all the new mesodermic tissues in the body. And cerebral cortex is ectodermic tissue, and it controls all the ectodermic tissues in the body. So it all really makes a lot of sense. And this is just saying that when we go into the conflict active state here, we have cell proliferation. So if the organ or tissue is brainstem or cerebellum derived, so endodermic or old mesodermic tissue. So if, say, for example, a woman had what's called a nest-worry conflict, say if her child was sick, then her mammary glands are going to start growing on the mother-child side, because we have a biological handedness that comes into play here too. So if the woman is right-handed, her left side is her mother-child side, and her right side is her partner's side, which includes everybody not perceived as a mother-child. So the mammary glands would start growing, and it's basically our body trying to provide a biological solution to our conflict, our problem. So in this case, even though a lot of our conflicts these days are figurative and the solution might not always be optimal, but it's trying to provide that biological solution. So either way, she's growing mammary gland cancer at that point, basically. But the purpose is to provide more milk to help, say, nourish the baby back to health is the idea. So it's our body trying to help us. So we're having tissue growth there. That's derived from the cerebellum, actually. So that's old mesodermic tissue, that mammary gland. And then once the child is healthy again, so now her conflict is resolved, then basically she'll move into the repair phase. So that's down below here, the CL. So now we're no longer conflict active. We're no longer in that sympathetic state. Now we can move into the repair phase. So now this is sympathetic, parasympathetic, so more rest and digest. And really a lot of this is, when we learn this, it just makes us more aware of our state of being, of our bodies, of how we're feeling, if we're noticing if we're conflict active and seeing, okay, why am I conflict active now? Can I downgrade and resolve this conflict? Because then my repair phase symptoms are going to be a lot less, because usually when we notice the symptoms, it's repair phase. So as we move into this repair phase.
I have a question, Daniel. So
Yeah.
around the situation, so for example, we have a mother who has a baby, and the baby or the infant is sick. So then the mammary glands and the cells of the mammary glands start to proliferate so that she can then provide more milk and nourish the baby. What if this child is now a teenager, adolescent, or an adult? Are those same mammary cells proliferating? And could they proliferate in, if the baby is fine now, those cells start to slow down their proliferation process and she doesn't have cancer. But if her child, who is an adolescent, gets sick and is really sick to the point where they're in the hospital, is that going to manifest into cancer right away? Or how long does it typically take for this to manifest?
Yeah. I mean, of course, it all depends on each person's and each woman's interpretation of the conflict, every person, right? But say most likely the moment the child got sick, it could initiate this program basically right away. And of course, each individual is unique, but yeah, and likely if she perceived the conflict as this necessary conflict pertaining to her child, then likely right away the lesion would form. And, if she did, then that's what would happen. And she would start growing. Basically, the mammary glands would start growing. Basically, they would grow, dependent on the intensity that she perceived the conflict and the duration. So they would just keep growing until she felt like there had been a resolution. And yes, like you said, it would actually happen, even if her child, if she still perceived her child as her child, but he was an adult, it would still happen. And it can actually even happen with the partner on the partner side as well. So it's just
Mm.
in this case, they're all different, all the programs, but so if she moved into that repair phase, so say now the child is healthy, whether the child's an adult or a child, then she moves into the repair phase, and now there's going to be fluid, like basically, and the lesion that forms in the brain is going to fill with fluid. So that's why it says edema here. Edema is just fluid filled. So and there'll be fluid going to the tissues, and those tissues will start breaking down as well. So there'll be, fungi and tubercular bacteria and things like this breaking down that tumor. And unfortunately, often women might even get a mastectomy at that point because the tumor might break open. And then obviously it's kind of alarming, but if we know this, we can just know, okay, good, I'm in the repair phase now. I'm towards the end. And so we're in this parasympathetic state, and the tumor's being broken down, if it's obviously brainstem or cerebellum derived. And then we have this epicrisis, and this often happens, interestingly, in the middle of the night. Like if sometimes we wake up at 2 or 3 a.m. and we're wide awake. It's like, why am I wide awake? Often it's because we've gone deep into the repair phase of a program. And of course, many of these are just, we go through conflicts all the time. So they can be much more minor conflicts that we pick up one day and we resolve it, that evening. And maybe we go into our epicrisis at night, and that might just last for a little while, or it might last for a few days. But this would also be when people would have things, again, depending on the program that's running in their body, things like epileptic seizures or heart attacks, or just really amplified symptoms with whatever they're going through, maybe like when they're having a flu or a cold, it's just the worst part of it. And then you come back into the B phase of the repair, and it says scarring here because the neuroglia in the brain are basically repairing that lesion now. And unfortunately, sometimes people get brain scans because they have some pressure in the brain because of the fluid accumulation. And then it's going to look like brain tumors, but it's really just our body just healing, right? It's all meaningful. And then we would go back to homeostasis. So as long as we feel, in this case, comfortable that our child is healthy again and we've resolved the conflict, then we'll go back to homeostasis. And of course, we could find a perceptual solution. Like if the child died, for example, it doesn't mean it's just going to grow forever. If we can just resolve that conflict and let go of that, like we can find that perceptual solution as well. Like the practical solution would be the child being healthy again, of course. But if that's not available, there are other ways to resolve it. Yeah, that's where it's unique to the individual, basically. And I'll just add up above here, the cerebral cortex and cerebral medulla, these operate in the opposite way. Whereas if we go into the conflict active, there's actually an ulceration of the tissues or a change of function in a few cases, like glands and things, but ulceration meaning we're having cell loss, tissue loss. And then in the repair phase, again, this is normally when we notice the symptoms, we're having, the tissues are being restored. That would be actually the ducts, the breast ducts are actually from the cerebral cortex, ectodermic tissue, and there's a widening in the conflict active. And then there's it's going to be uncomfortable. There's going to be some pain and discomfort as it rebuilds. And one of my friends, Castine, actually, who first taught me German New Medicine, when her daughter went away, she actually had that because it's like a lost conflict of a loved one, and she went away for school and she was missing her, and they're very close. So but she knew German New Medicine, so she just iced it, and she just listened to her body and resolved the conflict, rested, and she was fine after a few weeks. So
Wow. And in her mind, she was reminding herself that her daughter is safe. I know I miss her, but she is safe.
Yeah,
And I am well. And
exactly.
instead of going down the fear hole of, oh my gosh, I'm so worried about her and I want her to come home, and in that mindset.
Yes, exactly. And it's just so tragic because, and I've known women who've had this where they get the mastectomy, and it's like they're actually, it's all natural what's going on. If we could just understand what's happening and stay out of the fear, as you said. And the way it can go so often with the mastectomy though is, you've had your breast removed, which has got to be traumatic, I can imagine, for a woman. And then there's so many follow-up conflicts that occur because this metastasis theory is just more fear-mongering, as you said, and there's no proof for it. But say if what could happen if a breast is removed? Now, self-devaluation conflict locally into these localized lymph nodes. So that's a totally different conflict, a totally different tissue type. And that often occurs. And then on the scar, they could get what's called the disfigurement conflict. And that could be a melanoma, basically, because they've been disfigured. And then it could go into the pleura, which is protective of the chest, and that would be like an attack against the chest conflict. And with all the fear mongering, it can go into the lungs, which is a death fright conflict. So they're all different conflicts, but you can see how it cascades if you get stuck in this fear mongering system. And then they get chemo and very poor outcomes at that point. So unfortunately, does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. It's also, I can understand why this information has been
Yeah,
hidden for so long.
yeah. Because Dr. Hamar, like in 1981, once he put a large body of the work together, he took the findings back to the University of Tübingen, where he did his PhD, I believe it was. He went there, and they just came down and just basically suppressed it. They just said, no, you have to refute it. And then they fired him. And then he kept developing it. And they ended up stripping his medical licenses. He kept helping people. And in 93, they actually even took him to court and seized 6,500 of his files, all these terminal cancers and these type of diagnoses. And of that, over 90% of them were, fully recovered because learning the German new medicine. And he believes, though, that if we didn't have the initial conflict shock, because a lot of those people, they did recover, but a lot of them still had the initial scary diagnoses. If we didn't have that, it's like 99% of all types of cancers and everything will just survive, basically. Whereas now it's just like if they do chemo and things like that, after 5 or 7 years, there's only a few percent that are still alive generally, right? So
But applying the what is it, the five principal,
biological laws, yes. Yeah,
five biological laws is a lot. You can't really monetize that, can
exactly.
you?
Exactly right.
But you
That's
can
why.
make a lot of money from offering chemotherapy.
Yes, exactly. You're exactly right. And they even put him in jail. Like, you're right. That's why they came down so hard, right? The people up top. So it's unfortunate because, yeah, it's like $1 trillion industry. He died a few years ago, about 6 years ago. But as you mentioned, it really is growing now because we're all so much more aware of,
The
of the
truth.
corruption and, yeah, and the truth, and really seeking the truth. It's just so important, isn't it? And the truth is always a lot more empowering, like what you're doing, so much more empowering for the women, and like so much more freeing and beautiful, and just life is better with the truth, basically, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that makes sense, I guess, for a little intro, and we'll continue on. And anytime, please just jump in, and if there's questions. And if I get a little too deep into the weeds, let me know and we can take it
It's
out.
just so interesting to me
Yeah.
because there's literal science to show the lesions on the brain. Like we have
Yes,
scans to prove
thousands.
that there's a correlation between the what is being manifested in the body when we look at the brain, when we look at the lesions on the brain.
Yeah, it's just as you said, there's no, good reason that it's been suppressed except for the corruption and them wanting to keep it for themselves. They use it. And, they even did apparently test it, themselves in the back. And then he went through several university reviews. There's never been any fault found with any of it. And he can always figure things out. And yeah, it always correlates 100% of the time. It's like the most pure science there is, basically, So. Yeah. Anyway, we are where we are, but fortunately it's still here. We have the knowledge and we're all learning. So, so it's just basically we'll move into the uterus and fallopian tubes here. And this is just showing us that it's endodermic tissue derived from the brainstem. So, and the color coding, it'll make more sense in a while, but it's just, there's a color coding for the different brain regions, which, you know, we could kind of see up here. So it's like
Right.
this.
And for anyone listening to this in their car or they have it in their earbuds, I highly recommend you go back and watch this video, because what I'm seeing on the screen right now is making it a lot easier for me to understand what Daniel is describing.
Yeah, definitely. It makes it a lot easier. Okay, so we'll go through. So the uterus is located in the female pelvis behind the urinary bladder. The uterus is held in place by uterine muscles known as myometrium. The outer layer of the uterus consists of the peritoneal membrane that gives additional support to the organ. Throughout the menstrual cycle, the endometrium grows a tissue layer rich of blood vessels to provide an optimum environment for an embryo. If the fertilization of the egg does not occur, the endometrial lining is shed and expulsed during menstruation. The uterus opens into the vagina through the cervix or neck of the uterus. Two fallopian tubes connect the uterus with the ovaries. The tubes produce a secretion that aids to carry sperm and the fertilized ovum to the uterus, where the blastocyte adheres to the endometrium. Next to nourishing the developing fetus, the uterus secretes prostaglandin, a hormone-like substance that stimulates uterine contraction at the beginning of labor. The uterus and fallopian tubes consist of intestinal cylinder epithelium, originate from the endoderm, and are controlled from the brainstem. So yeah, that's just going with what we were saying. Hopefully that all makes sense. I can send you all this after too, and you can always send it out to your listeners if they want to study it themselves. At first, the female reproductive system had two uteri that eventually grew together, forming one single organ. Two uteri also form initially in the human embryo, fusing into a single uterus during the development of the female fetus. The same process takes place with the original two bladders. Interesting. The uterus and fallopian tubes are controlled from the center of the brainstem. So this is just showing us where that'll show up. Note, the uterus, fallopian tubes, and the prostate gland share the same brain relay. Sometimes they share the same relay. So that's in the brainstem. That's where the lesion will be. Hopefully, oh yeah, they have a picture of it here too. So we'll see that in a minute. The biological conflict linked to the uterus and fallopian tubes is a procreation conflict or an implantation conflict. Hence, a miscarriage, an abortion, not getting pregnant, as well as the loss of a child or grandchild can trigger the conflict. In addition, the uterus and fallopian tubes correspond to a gender conflict experienced as an ugly conflict with a male. So feeling humiliated by a man, verbal insults, disrespectful treatment by a partner, spouse, male, or relative friend, offensive behavior of a colleague, or harassment by a former boyfriend, ex-spouse, or a male authority are possible conflict scenarios. A distressing gynecological exam could also provoke the conflict. So, makes sense. Conflict active phase. Starting with the DHS. So this is the conflicts occurred. Now we're into the conflict active phase. So hopefully that all makes sense. The biological conflict is what causes it, what initiates this. And now we're into the conflict active. Starting with the DHS, which is the conflict. During the conflict active phase, cells in the uterus proliferate proportionally to the intensity of the conflict. The biological purpose of the cell increase is to thicken the uterus mucosa to aid the implantation of the fertilized egg. So like I was saying, there's always this purpose. Painful menstrual periods. The contraction of the uterus muscles is stimulated by the hormone prostaglandin that is produced in the uterus mucosa. The overproduction of prostaglandin during the conflict active phase of a procreation or gender conflict causes the uterus to contract more strongly than normal, resulting in painful menstrual cramps. So because we believe that if women don't have any of these conflicts, these sexual conflicts that we're going to be going through, then they wouldn't have to deal with these challenging periods, you know?
Well, this is interesting because I do have a friend who has a child that was born female and is moving through, yeah, just like moving through. I want to say they're just somewhat confused, feeling as though they're in the wrong body.
Yes.
And their child has really, really extremely painful periods. And
Mm.
that was my initial thought when I was when talking with my friend and just saying, I think your kid here is resisting their biological purpose,
Mhm.
and therefore their uterus and reproductive organs are aching and feeling very sore.
Yeah, it's a tough one. There's so much going on now, right? With all the propaganda, basically, unfortunately. And yeah, and so many causes of conflicts these days too, right? I can imagine for the young people. So,
It also makes a lot of sense, just going back to what you were speaking to before around having implantation challenges.
mhm.
Um, I wonder if this would speak to ectopic pregnancy as well. If within the relationship, the woman is not feeling overly secure or happy with her partner, or they're in some sort of dysregulation, or they've been fighting a lot, like it could make sense as to why the um, they would have challenges with conception.
Yeah. There's a couple that we get into later that specifically they find, cause the issues with conception, the infertility, like different conflicts that we'll go through in a minute, like that affect the ovaries and the cervix. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah, those ones just they end up affecting that. So okay, should I carry on with this one?
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. With prolonged conflict activity, so hanging conflict. So this is really when we have an issue, because that's when we're basically getting triggered back and forth between the repair phase and the conflict active phase, because whatever's going on, it's not fully resolved for us. So with prolonged conflict activity, like these are all the chronic conditions, are hanging conflicts. A cauliflower shaped growth, referred to as uterus cancer or endometrial cancer, forms as a result of the continuing cell augmentation. If the rate of cell division exceeds a certain limit, conventional medicine considers the cancer as malignant. Below that limit, the growth is regarded as benign or diagnosed as a uterine polyp. So it's just saying really it's all the same. It's just depending on the intensity and duration of the conflict. A growth that develops on a flat plane is termed endometrial hyperplasia. There are no symptoms during the conflict active phase. In the fallopian tubes, however, a compact growth might temporarily obstruct the affected tube, causing pain, especially during ovulation. On this brain CT, so now we get to see the brain, we see a Hummer focus in the uterus relay, corresponding to a uterus cancer. The Hummer focus in the control center of the liver shows the impact of a starvation conflict, which occurred most likely together with the conflict related to the uterus. Okay, so that's the liver up there. And it's sharp ringed. This is fairly sharp ringed, we can see when it's conflict active. And then it becomes more of a blurry, thicker ring in the repair phase because it fills with fluid. And sometimes it looks a little darker or a little lighter, depending on which phase as the repair is happening. And again, that's why we don't want to get those brain scans at these points, because they'll say brain tumor and try to cut out part of people's brains, unfortunately. Healing phase. So following the conflict resolution, fungi or mycobacteria. So now we've resolved the conflict. Following the conflict resolution, fungi or mycobacteria such as TB, tubercular bacteria, remove the cells that are no longer needed. The healing process is accompanied by night sweats. When fungi assist healing, this causes uterine candidiasis. The discharge produced during the cell breakdown is excreted through the vagina. The discharge is white, has a distinct foul-smelling odor, and might contain blood. So if women are ever noticing like a bit of an unusual odor, it might be because they're kind of stuck in a hanging healing, or they're just in the repair phase and they're just going to move right through it. But if it doesn't go away, if it becomes a little bit chronic, they might be stuck in a hanging healing. So they'll have to, they might want to look at what's causing it and try to avoid those triggers.
Well, they could look, I mean, any doctor is going to tell them that they just have a yeast infection or they have bacterial vaginosis, which they could, that seems to be some symptom for something deeper that's going on, some conflict that's going on.
Exactly. That's like this, right? Like the uterine candidiasis, right? It's just because it's not completing that is the issue, I mean, if the program would just complete, then it would be fine. So yeah, we're stuck. We keep getting triggered. Like we keep going back to the situation where we're being disrespected or whatever it is, that situation. Sleeping with the guy who isn't good for us or whatever it happens to be, that could be it potentially. So the vaginal, I mean, and it's not saying the guy might be good. It's just something in the way it was perceived, that interaction, it's not saying the person is a bad person or anything. It's just, the way we perceive things.
It's the way the woman is perceiving the relationship, the way she is
Exactly.
perceiving that man.
Yes, or each situation that triggers her. Yeah. And that's the tricky, well, one of the things is really with the awareness, because sometimes when we have the conflict occur, other things can then start to become associated with it. They become what we call tracks, like triggers essentially to initiate the program again. Like if you were eating a meal, for example, and something traumatic happened, like you're a kid and your dad whacked you on the back of the head and you're eating this food, that food could then basically become, like we could become allergic to that food, or becomes sensitivity, which we can clear, but it gets associated as a track, and other things could too, whatever's in our environment could get stored in the subconscious. So,
wow.
but which we can clear it all, but it just takes maybe some work sometimes. Yeah.
And is that something that people do with you, Daniel, is they'll contact you to say, hey, I have this program that seems to be running. I'm dealing with this conflict, this hanging conflict that just won't go away. I'd like to go a little deeper and clear it. Is that something you offer people?
Yeah. I'm like, yeah, I'm just really moving into working more and more with it. And I have that little study group now, Wednesdays at noon, where we meet on Zoom. And yeah, and I've been working with people, and obviously there's still a lot to learn. And really, I suppose the art of it all is just figuring out how to find help the person find the resolution for them, because that's where we are all unique. At least we have this template, we have all the info, we can know what to expect. We can know what type of conflict causes what type of symptoms, but then finding the solution for each person is where each person's unique in that way, right? What will give that person the resolution they need, So, yeah. So yeah, I am working with people though, yes. The vaginal discharge originates in the uterus or fallopian tubes and not, as assumed, in the vagina, since the vaginal canal is not endowed with an endodermal submucosa and subsequently not populated by fungi or bacteria. Okay. Endometritis, not to be confused with endometriosis, which will come up after. So endometritis is an inflammation in the uterus with painful swelling, with concurrent water retention, which is called the syndrome. So I'll just quickly explain that because it comes up quite a bit. That is what's called the kidney collecting tubules program. So this one is caused by an existential or an abandonment or a refugee conflict. So basically feeling like, we're having an existential crisis of sorts, or we're abandoned, we don't belong, we're like a fish out of water. Our kidneys, the kidney collecting tubules start to, grow a tumor there essentially, but it's again, not to be feared, it's just an adaptation. And the purpose is to retain water and other substances that like urea and creatinine to help us survive the perceived scarcity, basically. But the issue is that if this occurs when we're in the repair phase of another program, which is when we usually get the symptoms in the repair phase, it tends to amplify the symptoms because now we're retaining more fluids. So especially if people go into the hospital because they're, having symptoms and they're worried, and then they're not at home anymore and they're feeling more isolated, and maybe there's more fear mongering going on, that can initiate this program. And then they start retaining more fluids, and then it just causes more complications. And then if they get an IV on top of it, that just adds more fluid, and it can be quite dangerous, actually. So it's just a good thing to be aware of. So with concurrent water retention, so that's what they're talking about, as a result of an active abandonment and existence conflict, the swelling increases and so does the pain. In the fallopian tubes, the swelling could temporarily block the affected tube. Since the fallopian tubes are permeable, the discharge produced during the decomposing process might leak into the abdominal cavity. A tubal inflammation is called a salpingitis or adnexitis. Whether the conflict affects the right or left fallopian tube is random. Okay. With an intense healing phase, the outer wall of the uterus tumor might break, resulting in acute bleeding or hemorrhaging, particularly during menstruation when the tumor removal process, or sorry, the tumor removal concurs with the shedding of the decidua. Hence, heavy menstrual bleeding might point to relapses of a uterus-related conflict. Light bleeding accompanies healing when the preceding conflict activity was less intense, or if a woman is already postmenopausal or is not menstruating at the time when the healing takes place. And then this is just a note: if the required microbes are not available upon the resolution of the conflict because they were destroyed through an overuse of antibiotics, the additional cells remain. So eventually the growth becomes encapsulated with connective tissue. In conventional medicine, this is usually diagnosed as a benign cancer or a uterine polyp. So, antibiotics, which as we know is like against life, basically, is what it means. We don't have the necessary microbes and bacteria to break down the cells so then they can remain, which is usually okay. It's usually, fine, but just not optimal. So they say that, well, obviously you're drinking the raw milk. I know you drink raw milk, so that's a good way to make sure we have the microbes. And I'm sure you haven't taken antibiotics in quite a while, and neither have I. And then they even say like licking a dog, like if someone that can help give us the microbes. Or I drove all around Mexico like the winter before this winter, and I feel like I got lots of microbes there just eating tacos all over the place. So yeah, so we just want to
Now,
have.
okay, well, this brings me, I mean, we don't, you don't have to answer this because we're focusing on female
Sure.
reproductive here,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
um, just the getting like the bug when you're away or in a different country and getting food
Yeah.
poisoning, right? So that's an interesting conflict. Your
Good
stomach
point.
and your microbiome are just freaking out. And food
Mhm.
poisoning is so painful. It's like, but what I'm hearing and seeing, especially through this explanation here, is that when we are in the healing phase, it hurts. It can hurt. It can be very painful, lots of
Yeah.
swelling. But that is a sign that the process is resolving itself. The conflict is being resolved.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another nice thing about this. Of the many nice things is that we're just not resisting our symptoms anymore. I'm just understanding them, and I'm knowing that, okay, I'm in the repair phase now. And that's almost most of the time when we get our symptoms is a repair phase. So it's more just a cause to be happy, to rejoice. We're in the repair phase. We're resolving the conflict. And like what you said, what they believe is going on when we get sick, when we go on holiday. So a lot of times people, have conflicts going, they're hanging conflicts at home, working, and just life is challenging. And they go on holiday, and then they come into the repair phase. And so now they're going to get some symptoms. A lot of people do get sick when they go on holiday because, they move into the repair phase. They're able to resolve their conflicts. But then also we might have flown thousands of miles all of a sudden, right? Very quickly. And there's all these new microbes that are not familiar to us. So apparently if we eat those microbes and we've gone into the repair phase of a program that we are running, then it amplifies the symptoms and we get those additional symptoms. So, and that happened for me once or twice when I was driving through Mexico, but I wasn't resisting. I was just like, okay, I'm in the repair phase, good. And I took in
Well,
some.
this is so beautiful because it's true, and I'm witnessing women in birth
Mhm.
when they are resisting, when they're trying to fight the waves that are coming over their body as the cervix is peeling back and the fundus is developing so that they can get that baby out of their body. If they're fighting those feelings and in a space of fear and, oh no, I don't want this next one to come, it's going to feel so bad, right? It's going to be so intense. That's where she can feel like she's suffering and an immense amount of pain, whereas the women who choose to surrender into the feelings of their body during the process and love the idea that another contraction is coming because she's going to meet her baby soon, these are the women that often feel more ecstatic or more peaceful during their birth experience.
Yeah, it makes so much sense. And it really is. It just makes all the difference in the world, getting out of fear. And, like we were talking, just getting out of the conventional system just is a huge step. Once we're out of that, it's just all fear-based, and it just makes a huge difference. So yeah, like my intention is to never go to a hospital again for myself anyway, hopefully. But of course they are good at emergency medicine, the cuts, and they're amazing at that. So give them that. And they have great diagnostic tools. So I mean, it would be nice, like Dr. Hamar, he, figured that once this takes over as the primary medicine, the primary system, then 95% of the big business you reference will be gone basically, but it'll be just fantastic because they're still great at the emergency medicine, and they have lots of great diagnostic tools. Like we want to be able to do the brain scans sometimes, can help us figure out what conflicts we have running, what's going on. Yeah, and constellations even, which cause behavioral changes. There are certain groupings of conflicts that can cause behavioral changes, but we can get into that another time, maybe. Okay, so should we carry on?
Yes, please.
Okay, so into the uterus muscles. So this is just saying that it's deriving from the midbrain, which is also endodermic tissue. It's part of the brainstem. It's just the top here of the brainstem. So the uterus muscle. So the middle layer of the uterus, known as the myometrium, makes up most of the uterus volume. The myometrium is for the most part composed of smooth muscles. The main function of the uterus muscles is to hold the fetus and to aid its delivery during childbirth. The hormone oxytocin, produced in the pituitary gland, induces the contraction of uterus muscles during labor. The uterus muscles derive from the endoderm and are controlled from the midbrain, which is part of the brainstem, as we just said. So note, like every biological special program of nature, what they call disease, a pregnancy progresses in 2 phases. Throughout the first 3 months of pregnancy, the muscle tension increases, so sympathectonia, so that's just more sympathetic, to secure the newly implanted embryo. However, in order to prevent a premature birth, the uterus muscles relax for the duration of the remaining 6 months of gestation. So vagatonia. So we're in that parasympathetic now. Unexpected distress, conflict activity experienced by the unborn or by the mother can therefore cause a miscarriage. Starting at the onset of labor, the uterus muscles contract with simultaneous rhythmic clonic peristaltic motions to facilitate delivery. From an evolutionary point of view, the tonic-clonic labor contractions become the blueprint for the epileptoid crisis of the striated muscles. That epileptoid crisis part is basically the childbirth, really. that part of the repair phase that we noticed the most. Yeah, so that's like the childbirth, essentially. So it's just saying we're in a more sympathetic state for the first 3 months of pregnancy, and then more parasympathetic for the last 6. And that's potentially why the first 3 are kind of the period where the women tend to sometimes lose the child.
And they also feel extremely sick, like they're drained, they feel exhausted, their body is working really hard to maintain and hold that pregnancy in the uterus.
Yeah, exactly. So, and apparently what happens also, which is interesting, is once women are pregnant, they switch to perceiving, because there's conflicts that can cause men to perceive in a more feminine way and women to perceive in a more masculine way. And also when women are pregnant, they switch too, and to perceiving more masculine, to like protect their baby is the idea, just temporarily. Biological conflict. The biological conflict linked to the uterus muscles is not being able to hold the fetus. So complications during pregnancies, miscarriages, abortions, or not getting pregnant, hence not being able to have children because of an early menopause, the removal of both ovaries, infertility, a mate's infertility or erectile dysfunction, difficulties conceiving, or an unfulfilled desire to have more children are typical conflict situations. Having the tubes tied, the use of an IUD to prevent pregnancy, or taking contraceptives might evoke the conflict on a subtle psychobiological level. A woman can experience the conflict also with or on behalf of a female member of the group. Oh, a quick thing that just came to my mind there. Also, when women do take the hormonal birth control, that switches them to perceiving more masculine as well, which is, it's obviously not a good idea to take that. But I wonder if your friend might have, you know what I mean? Your friend's daughter, I wonder if she might be taking it, and maybe it's
Mhm.
adding to the confusion, you know what I mean?
I
Because
hear
it's
you.
forcing you to be more masculine. So if she is, it might be good to get off of that
Yeah,
potentially.
and get that IUD out of your body, feel into your
Yeah.
natural cycle, feel into your natural hormone. And what we're reading here is that a woman can experience the conflict also with or on behalf of a female member of the group. So, say her sister or a really good friend of hers that she's living with at the time.
Mhm.
Is having all of these challenges and is having this conflict, feeling like she's not able to get pregnant or has an IUD,
Mhm.
sh-
Yeah.
like she could be feeling the conflict for her friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Or someone close. You could imagine how, yeah, you can imagine how like a mother, if she really wants her child to get her daughter to get pregnant, I can imagine that doing it too.
Hmm.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and the IUD, obviously that I think that just causes other issues too. And to be honest, once we learn this, we don't think any women should go get PAPs or any of that either. They're just looking for trouble that's not really there and causing, giving women scary diagnoses like precancerous cells. And sometimes they have an IUD and they're saying, oh, you have some precancerous cells, but of course some little adaptations are going to be occurring there with this foreign object, sitting there, right? So yeah, it makes sense. Anyway, conflict active. So now we're conflict active. So after the biological conflict that we just went through, cell proliferation with the formation of uterine fibroids. The biological purpose of the additional muscle tissue is to increase the tension and to strengthen the uterus muscles in order to be better able to hold the fetus or to facilitate delivery. The size of the fibroids is determined by the degree and duration of conflict activity. So healing phase. So once we've resolved the conflict, the muscle tension normalizes. However, to secure procreation, the fibroids remain past the completion of the healing phase. Fibroids located close to the endometrium of the uterus can cause acute bleeding, particularly during the epicrisis, and heavy menstrual periods since the fibroids are covered with endometrial lining that shed during menstruation. So that makes sense. With the syndrome, that is, with water retention as a result of an active abandonment or existence conflict involving the kidney collecting tubules, the retained water increases the size of the fibroids. A large growth in the uterus musculature might be diagnosed as a myometrial sarcoma. Uterine prolapse. So the uterus is also held in place by ligaments, a lasting self-devaluation conflict. I am not good enough there. That's an example of the conflict. So feeling you're not good enough in that way weakens the structures, causing the uterus to descend into the vaginal canal. So the self-devaluation conflicts are all mostly that cerebral medulla, which we'll look at again in a minute, and they're usually self-evaluation, and there's an ulceration in the conflict active. So anyway, we'll get more into that after, but does that make sense there though?
Yeah,
That
so going back to the uterine fibroids, so a lot of women in pregnancy, if they are engaging with the medical obstetric complex, they will see through the ultrasounds and the scans that they're doing, they'll find these fibroids and deem the woman as high risk because there's a potential that the fibroid could rupture and cause bleeding and then hemorrhaging during the birthing process. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts around that. And these women are not, they're not really allowed to birth at home. The doctors don't advise it.
mm,
They are deemed high risk and therefore should be in a hospital to be birthing their baby. So what do you think around having fibroids while pregnant?
yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I can't, I don't know probably enough about it, and I haven't, you dealt with a lot more of it than me. I wonder what's like, have you dealt with women who've had them and then they've still done the birth outside of the hospital?
From my experience,
Mhm.
the few women that I've worked with who have had they could, I mean, at this point, I'm working with women that don't do scans, so we don't know
Yeah,
if they
yeah.
have a fibroid or not. But for the women that did discover it, by the end of the pregnancy, what happened is the fibroid moved away from the cervix
Mm,
as the uterus grew with the pregnancy, and so therefore became a non-issue.
mm, mm.
Or the fibroid was gone by the end of the pregnancy, they couldn't find it. So
Yeah. I would tend to like you, I would tend to just I feel like we'll be okay, if we trust our bodies and yeah, stay out of the fear. I would imagine it would be okay.
and I'm seeing here that the fibroid is telling us that you're in the healing phase. She's in the healing phase.
Yeah, yeah. Like it does grow in the conflict active phase, and but then the muscle tension normalizes in the healing phase, and the fibroids remain for a while. Yeah, and it sounds like I mean, they're there to help out, basically, right?
Right.
So
And then as for uterine prolapse, this is a self-devaluation conflict. So the woman doesn't feel like she's good enough. Good enough in what aspect of her life? Like, I'm
likely
not
in
good
that
enough.
area, in say as a mother or birthing, something perceived, that would affect that area, basically, something motherly or yeah, or something localized. But yeah, that would basically it. And like we can go through maybe another time, but all the self-evaluation, like it's really interesting because I had lots of back issues for years since like high school. And it just made a lot of sense finally once I discovered this. Like it's pretty much gone. Yeah. But I had like even a herniated disc in the mid-20s, and the low back is like, like a central self-devaluation. You're just too critical of yourself and you're not feeling supported and like things like this, basically. And also, interestingly, I had this, which I still don't know what caused this, but I had it's called a varicocele, which is like the veins, they're kind of like become like varicose veins around the left testicle, like the veins that supply the left testicle. And then, of course, I didn't know anything. I was like 11 or 12, and they did an operation where they cut into the, you know, kind of abdominal wall down low on the left there. And then they did something, who knows what. But anyway, apparently the testicles and ovaries tie back to L2, L3. And that's where I later had a herniated disc at one point too. So just all makes a lot of sense. And it's just very interesting. And I could see that I also would have been devaluing myself in that way. And then also, yeah, I would like to figure out what caused those initial varicose veins there, though, but I haven't figured that one out yet. But anyway, always more to learn. I don't know how I go. Oh, the point of that is in the conflict active phase of all those self-devaluation conflicts, there is an ulceration of the tissues, but the biological purpose is found at the end, which we'll get into in a minute with the ovaries too, where the organ or tissue is actually made stronger, more robust, is so we're better equipped to deal with future challenges, essentially. So there's always like this purpose. So as long as we can resolve, so it's really nice again, because if I ever feel a bit of pain in my body somewhere, I'm like, okay, I just must have been devaluing myself. Now I'm in the repair phase. I'm building back stronger. And then again, I'm not resisting that little bit of discomfort that I'm feeling because I'm understanding its repair phase. So like,
And can, maybe
yeah,
before we continue on,
yes,
Daniel,
yeah.
I'd like to go into the 5 biological laws.
Yeah,
Is
okay.
that something that we can touch on and then close our conversation for today and come back another time?
Yeah, yeah. You want
Because
to do
the,
the, go ahead.
sorry, I was just going to say, because I'm trying to understand how I can apply these principles for myself when I notice that there's a specific conflict,
Mhm.
or perhaps a hanging conflict, these chronic symptoms that are showing up in the body. How can I then go about applying these specific laws so that I'm resolved?
Yes, yes, yeah. And that's the thing, that it can be tricky. I mean, I think it could happen instantly, but when it's been chronic, we've been having these things for years. I feel like it can take a bit more time. Like I definitely had a lot of that, the self-devaluation on my left side, and I'm left-handed. So it's like that's my partner side. So I can just see why I would have devalued myself on that side as well in certain areas. So, and I just feel like it always is getting better, but it's like, been a bit of a gradual process, I would say. Not to say it couldn't just happen overnight as well. We could just fully resolve whatever the conflict is. But yeah, we can go through that. So you want to go through the laws now, or do you want to do any more, or just into the laws now? Whatever you prefer.
Why don't we go into the laws and come back to the female I mean, there's so much here. It's like it's just golden information, and so I don't want to stop, but just because of time, I think today we'll finish off with the 5 biological laws.
Okay, and I won't read all of this for the laws. We'll just do a brief. So yeah, here's the laws. So the first law is called the iron rule of cancer. So the criterion here are every quote disease, like hereinafter called significant biological special program, originates from a DHS. So that's the Dirk-Hammer syndrome, named after his son. So that's the conflict shock, which is an unexpected, highly acute, and isolating conflict shock that occurs simultaneously in the psyche, the brain, and on the corresponding organ. So they're one unit, which just makes sense, right? We're one unit, our psyche, our brain, our body, our soul.
Totally. Yeah.
Second criterion, the content of the conflict determines which organ will be affected and from which area of the brain the SBS will be controlled. Third criterion, every SBS runs synchronously on the level of the psyche, the brain, and the organ. So does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
So it
Perfect.
manifests in the body in some way.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, and it's running synchronously on all 3 levels because, like we showed earlier with that diagram, like it's all about our perceptions, of course, and that's how we're going to then resolve the conflict. And then the brain, the lesion, and then it goes through the phases. That'll be the next one that we get into, actually. We'll just continue on. So do you want it, like I can read all this, but maybe we just do a quick intro to each law, or what
Yeah,
would you? Yeah.
that's good.
Okay. And if we want to go back, we can. This is interesting. This just shows all the different, as I mentioned, like the brain stem with all the different relays for the organs or tissues, and the cerebellum. And they usually have a different conflict theme, which is interesting. Actually, that'll come up a bit later too. I'll just continue on here. Let's find the second law, the biological handedness. I mean, we could go through all this, but that would take a while. So maybe another time. But if you want to go through anything more, just let me know and we can slow it down. So the second biological law is what we already looked at, and this is the law of 2 phases. So the DHS is the biological conflict, like what we just got into, acute, isolating, and unexpected. And then every disease or illness, it runs in this 2-phase program, basically, where we have that conflict active phase. Generally, we're not noticing the symptoms in the conflict active phase. Like I mentioned with the self-devaluation conflicts, we're having an ulceration of the tissues. We're not really going to notice it. It's not really painful unless we do something that injures ourselves. Like sometimes people fall and their arm just snaps like nothing, or they tear their ligaments so easily. That's usually because we've had this conflict running and the tissues have been ulcerating, so they're weakened. Or like another good case is the death rate conflict, which affects the lung alveoli. And we actually have a tissue proliferation in those lung alveoli. And the purpose is to help us deal with the perceived conflict. So we're able to take in more oxygen and we're going to be faster and stronger. And, if we get a lung scan, it's going to look like cancer in the lungs. But then in the repair phase, so once we, say we get away from the tiger or the war ends, we resolve the death rate conflict. Now those tissues are broken down and we have tuberculosis, basically. So the tubercular bacteria break down those extra tissues and we have blood and phlegm potentially. And then we go back to homeostasis once we resolve it. And in the case of the other one I mentioned, though, where say the tissues are ulcerating, like say if, we're devaluing ourselves, as long as we don't severely hurt ourselves, injure ourselves physically during that phase. Once we resolve that conflict and we, stop devaluing ourselves and we move through it, then the tissue is stronger at the end. So it's made stronger and more robust for future conflicts. So there's always this purpose. So yeah, that's just saying the law of 2 phases. That's the second biological law.
Okay.
So, as I mentioned, it's really nice. It just changes everything because now I'm very aware of when I'm conflict active, like if something happened, if I'm thinking about something, I'm like, okay, I just got to downgrade this, resolve this, let this go, make appropriate changes, take action if I have to, whatever I need to do to resolve this quickly, and then just move through the repair phase. And, this happens all the time, probably to lesser degrees. Like it could just be someone saying something to us that catches us, and it just triggers us basically. But we might be able to basically, if we can work through that in an hour, we might just sneeze as our epicrisis, right? That's about it, right? So it's a quick resolution of the conflict and a quick repair phase that's barely noticeable.
Wow, I love that because I've always felt that like sneezing, yawning, farting, burping, like this is all like
Yeah.
natural like ways of us moving energy and resolving little mini conflicts potentially going on in the body.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've had times where I've done energy healing with people and then they start like yawning like crazy, right? Like you were just mentioning. So it's like ways of releasing, really, isn't it? Yeah. But whereas if, say, that person says something to us and we hold on to that for 5 days and we're thinking about it and we're pissed off, then we might actually have a full-blown cold or a flu. You know what I mean? At the end, depending how we perceive that conflict, if that makes sense. So
Yes.
yeah, but either way, we're noticing when we're conflict active, we're trying to downgrade and resolve the conflict, and then we're not resisting the repair phase symptoms so much. We're trusting our bodies, we're knowing we're not getting into fear, we're knowing we're okay, we're healing, we're in the repair phase. So it's a lot more harmonious, basically. And they show lots of pictures of the lesions in the brain. So that he has thousands of brain scans of that. Okay, we'll move through to the third law. There's a lot of really good info in this too.
And this
I
is
mean,
available for anyone?
yeah, I can send it all to you. Like it's on the website. There's this Learning GNM website, which is great, and it's all there. And then you can also download them as PDFs too, if you want.
So
So
you're saying
yeah,
I don't have to go to med school for 12 years?
yeah, we don't have to go get robbed and get taught a bunch of largely nonsense. Yeah, yeah, no, fortunately. We can empower ourselves, and this is just showing a repair phase, where this could get diagnosed as a brain tumor, right? So when it's really just repairing, right? Healing.
Wow.
Yeah. So we'll move to the next one. There's a lot in here, though. It is really interesting if you want to, and we could even go through it all one day. It would just take a while. So this is the third biological law, the ontogenetic system of tumors. But this is really getting into the germ layers, like the brain layers, which we already went through. So there's the endoderm, which is the brain stem, the old mesoderm, which is the cerebellum, the new mesoderm, which is the cerebral medulla, and the ectoderm, which is the cerebral cortex. And there's basically like different conflict themes, like the endoderm, is fairly, it's called the old brain, and it's like largely to do with digestion, like lots of the digestive tract is that, and saying that more basic life forms really are just dealing with digesting, right? Getting food and digesting the food, basically. So, and the conflicts are mostly called morsel conflicts, like indigestible, whether physically, like or figuratively indigestible conflicts. And of course, most of our conflicts now are figurative, right? Social. And then the old mesoderm is the cerebellum. It's attack type of conflicts. So it's things like the pleura and the peritoneum and things like this that are protective, right? Like, so it could be if someone, like a woman had that, like I said, if she had that breast removed, it could be, and I know someone who had this actually, and it's like an attack against the chest, basically, right? So then you get mesothelioma there in the pleura, because that's a protective layer. So it's like attack, feeling dirtied, feeling soiled. It's also the dermis, which is the layer of skin under the epidermis. So the epidermis is from the ectoderm, the cerebral cortex, and it's separation conflict. So if we have skin issues, it's like wanting space or wanting contact, like we're missing someone. But the dermis, which is the layer below, is like feeling attacked, feeling dirtied, feeling defiled. So it can be like acne or like the melanoma, like I mentioned earlier, like that disfigurement conflict on the scar if a woman got the breast removed. It's just things like that.
But something like eczema or psoriasis, that would be the ectoderm.
That's more the ectoderm. Yeah. So yeah. And yeah. Yeah, basically separation conflicts. And again, if we're having issues though, it's just because we're stuck in a hanging healing. Otherwise, we would just work right through it, go through it quickly. Like I kind of had that red kind of stuff on the back of my arms since as long as I can remember. And probably I just wanted a bit more space when I was a kid, if you know what I mean. Have you noticed some people have that bump thing? Like if it's on the outer edges, it's usually more, it can be localized, but it can also be like it's on the outside. So it's like, give me some space. But if it was on the, say, stomach and we had a breakup, it might be because we're missing holding the partner, things like that. Yeah. And then the new mesoderm, that's mostly the skeletal system, like the bones, joints, ligaments, muscles, and also the ovaries and the testicles, like the hormone producing tissue, which we'll get into later or next time. And these ones are the ones where there's the ulceration and the conflict active, and it's usually to do with self-devaluation in some form. And then if we resolve it, though, it's kind of like a test. If we make it through, then the organ or tissue is made, more robust, stronger at the end. So we get the benefit, the biological purpose at the end. And then the ectoderm are mostly social type of conflicts, like separation or territorial loss or sexual conflicts. A lot of the women have a lot of the sexual conflicts. So yeah, because that's like the woman's territory, basically, your sexuality. Whereas the male territory is more like the external territory, and the woman is more like her sexuality and the home and children and things like that. Okay, so that's the third law, is basically just that it's all mapped out by the different germ layers and it all makes total sense and it's all very scientific. And the fourth biological law is about the microbes, and so this just is showing that this germ theory is a bunch of nonsense, and it's never been proven, and no viruses have ever been proven to exist, and they don't even exist, basically. And all of these things that they say are viruses or germs are getting us sick are really just already coming from within, and they're there to help us break down tissues or rebuild tissues, and they all have jobs. They're like, they call them microsurgeons even, and they just basically they're like, seasonal workers, basically. So they're ready to go. They're like the firefighters, there's a fire. Okay, they're going to come in there and do whatever. They have a job, basically. And like tuberculosis, it's not like that's from some virus. We had a death rate conflict, like in World War I, everyone had one, and mothers on behalf of their sons in the war and things like this. And they were growing extra tissue in their lungs. And then upon the resolution, the end of the war, they go into the repair phase, and then the tubercular bacteria within break down those extra tissues, and you have tuberculosis. And it only generally, well, it could kill people if it's a really, really intense conflict, but generally they would only die if they didn't have enough nutrition, because it can take quite a bit of nutrition, because you're, expelling all that phlegm and blood, and there's protein in that. So yeah, so tuberculosis is just a repair phase. Yeah.
So much sense.
Yeah, so all the microbes, all the germs, the bacteria, and all these things, they always invert everything, right? Like germs literally means like to sprout life, right? It's like new life, right? So it's not, we
I
don't
like
have
to say when I if I'm moving through a cold or a flu, I'm getting an immune upgrade. I'm in the process of an upgrade.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, like we've definitely resolved the conflict. So we're moving through that. And like the immune, I know we're so used to the immune system, but we actually don't even believe there is an immune system, because there's nothing to be immune to, right? It's just a support system, if anything, to help make us strong, but there's not actually anything, because that's kind of linked to the germ theory, right? Like we have to the germ theory. So we would say more just a support system. Yeah. It's like trying to shift out of all that.
I'm getting a systematic upgrade.
Yeah, yeah. And even just like, yeah, so many things, like even the fact that we have this big aversion to like germs, and that's dirty, and kind of indoctrinated into us, is all just coming from this fraudulent germ theory.
Daniel, I don't know what you're talking about. I lick my dog every day. I get a daily dose of licking my dog so that I'm
You're aligned with nature, yeah, because you're trusting your intuition. So you're connected to your intuition big time. Every so-called disease is part of a significant biological special program of nature. So this is the fifth law. So basically we have the iron rule of cancer is the first one, and that's that every conflict is initiated by the conflict shock. And then the second is the law of two phases, where each, disease, quote disease, what we call a significant biological special program, runs in this two course pattern: conflict active and then repair phase. And then the third one is the germ layers, so the different layers of the brain, which is all very scientific and makes sense because, the cerebral cortex is ectodermic tissue, controls all the ectodermic tissues in the body, and so on. And then the fourth one is the microbes. So all of the tubercular bacteria and the germs and the microbes and all of this are just there to break down and rebuild tissues and build up tissues. They all have jobs. And then the fifth is the quintessence, which is every so-called disease is part of a significant biological special program of nature created to assist an organism during unexpected distress. And yeah, this is humans and animals alike, so all of us. And then Dr. Hamar has a nice quote: "All so-called diseases have a special biological meaning. While we used to regard Mother Nature as fallible and had the audacity to believe that she constantly made mistakes and caused breakdowns, malignant, senseless, degenerative, cancerous growths, etc., we can now see, as the scales fall from our eyes, that it is with our ignorance and pride that were and are the only foolishness in our cosmos. Blinded, we brought upon ourselves this senseless, soulless, and brutal medicine. Full of wonder, we can now understand for the first time that nature is orderly and that every occurrence in nature is meaningful, even in the framework of the whole. Nothing in nature is meaningless, malignant, or diseased," basically. So it's all meaningful. Yeah. And the one thing I should add, though, is that, of course, a physical injury could happen, and that wouldn't be caused by a conflict shock necessarily, even though I did mention if we're devaluing ourselves, it might happen more easily. Like one of my friends, she actually had this brutal thing happen at work. She works in the hospital and a client died, and it was just a really messy situation. And then the elbow is associated with, like your ability, your work. And she probably had a severe self-evaluation that day. And then the next day she fell on a trampoline and it just broke like nothing. So,
Whoa.
I mean, most likely she was devaluing herself there. And the other two are severe malnutrition or poisoning that could cause conflicts, but like severe poisoning, not just as far as things like, glyphosate. And of course there's a lot of toxins and 5G and whatever else. Like I used to be more like trying to keep everything super clean, and I still eat healthy and do all the stuff, but I think the bigger thing is not to make conflicts about a lot of that stuff. Just know like we're strong, we can deal with these little challenges, like do what we can. Like I go to the spring to get my water and all this type of stuff, but I don't want to be too crazy. Like Melissa Sell is a good teacher and communicator of German medicine, and she was a chiropractor, and then she used to be, as many of us were, myself included, like you're more focused on the food and like, oh, got to be organic and this or that. And then if she ever ate out, she would be like, oh, the seed oil, and then she would get a breakout because feeling kind of like soiled, like dirtied, right? She'd have like pimples after. But once she learned this, she was able to just work, not get the pimples if she eats out one day and has some seed oil, right? So not making conflicts about things, unnecessarily.
And to just remain positive and be in a frequency, a higher frequency, and knowing and trusting that not everything is out to kill us. We're here to thrive. We want to survive. We want to thrive and be healthy and happy. And Daniel, every time I have a conversation with you, I feel so inspired. I feel excited for the future moving forward. And it's really nice to know that more people are stepping into the GNM mindset and are wanting to learn and eager to learn. And I'm going to link in the show notes how people can get a hold of you if they want to join your WhatsApp group, your study group, and get to talk to you privately, one-on-one, if they're dealing with some conflicts and need a little bit of support around resolving their conflicts. Yeah, that's information is going to be in the show notes for the listeners today. And I just want to say thank you so very much. If there's anything else you want to share, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for all that. And yeah, I feel the same. Like when I first met you and heard you speak at that little event that we were both speaking at, it was great. And I was very inspired too. And just it all, I just really appreciated what you were saying, and it was totally aligned for me. And then when I spoke, I could see you were feeling the same way. So yeah, it's really nice. And there is so many people now, kind of getting on this type of yeah, thinking in these type of ways, right? And it's so much more freeing and empowering. And yeah, and I love it. Yeah, and I'll send you my info. Well, I know you have some of it already, but I did have a website, and unfortunately I canceled it because I was going to make a new one, and I just haven't got it done yet. So anyway, but I will get it done eventually, in time. Yeah. So we want to wrap it up now, and then we can go through more of these next time.
Yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up and we'll come back to these. I'm definitely gonna have you back on the show. I know the listeners today their minds are just lit up and excited and inspired. So thank you very much, Daniel Williams. Really appreciate you and your presence today and all this knowledge that you have with GNM. And I look forward to speaking to you again. And for those of you listening, have a wonderful rest of your day and take care.
Great. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Bye.